She called 911 to report a firefighter. And seconds later, everything she thought she controlled disappeared. The firefighter had barely finished shutting off the engine when the weight of the night finally caught up with him. His turnout jacket was still on, streaked with soot and smelling faintly of smoke. A quiet reminder of the house fire he'd just helped contain only an hour earlier. He parked along the curb in front of his townhouse, technically his assigned spot, though the faded white line was half hidden beneath leaves and dust. All he wanted was a moment to breathe, maybe sip some water, before heading inside to shower and sleep. The neighborhood was calm, almost eerily so, with manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and the low hum of sprinklers ticking on and off in the distance. That calm didn't last long. From across the street, a door swung open with force. An older woman stepped out, her posture stiff, eyes already narrowed as if she'd been waiting for something to go wrong. She marched toward him with purpose, sandals slapping the pavement, her jaw set tight. He noticed her only when her shadow crossed the open truck door. At first, he assumed she was a neighbor needing help, maybe someone who smelled smoke earlier or wanted to know if everything was okay. He straightened slightly, instinctively ready to assist, the way he'd been trained to do. But the look on her face wasn't concern. It was accusation. She stopped a few feet away, arms planted on her hips, scanning his truck, his gear, and then his face as if inspecting a problem. Without so much as a greeting, she began talking fast, sharp words about rules, violations, and unauthorized use. She pointed at the truck, then at the street, then back at him. According to her, this was an HOA-controlled zone, emergency vehicle or not. She claimed no one was allowed to park there without approval. He tried to explain calmly, mentioning the fire, the long shift, the fact that he lived right there. He even gestured to the fire engines still visible at the end of the block. Lights dimmed but unmistakable. She didn't listen. Her voice grew louder, attracting the attention of a few neighbors peeking through curtains. She accused him of wasting water earlier, of blocking access, of pretending to be something he wasn't. The uniform, the radio clipped to his chest, the helmet resting on the seat, none of it seemed to register. To her, this wasn't a tired first responder coming home. This was someone breaking her rules. He felt the familiar mix of disbelief and exhaustion wash over him. He defaced flames, collapsing roofs, and life or death decisions without hesitation. Yet here he was being lectured on bylaws by someone who refused to see reason. He took a slow breath, choosing patience over frustration, hoping the situation would de-escalate on its own. But as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, her eyes hard with determination, it became clear this was only the beginning. She didn't hesitate. The moment the firefighter paused, choosing his words carefully, her thumb was already moving across her phone screen. With a sharp, deliberate motion, she brought the device to her ear, turning slightly away from him as if to signal that the conversation was over and something far more serious was about to begin. Her voice, which had already been loud, took on a new edge, urgent, dramatic, almost rehearsed. Nearby, a couple of neighbors slowed their steps, sensing that this wasn't just another HOA argument but something escalating fast. 911, she said, enunciating clearly, as if announcing it to everyone around her. The firefighter blinked in surprise, unsure if he'd heard correctly. For a split second, he thought she might be calling the HOA security line or maybe a board member. But then he heard her continue, her words tumbling out in a rush. She claimed there was a suspicious man in emergency gear misusing public resources, blocking the street, and refusing to comply with community rules. Each sentence seemed designed to paint him as a threat rather than a professional who had just finished saving lives. The dispatcher's calm voice floated faintly from the phone, asking standard questions: location, description, nature of the emergency. Karen answered with confidence, pointing openly at him as she spoke, her finger jabbing the air as if the person on the other end could see it. She described his truck, his uniform, even the equipment, twisting every detail into something alarming. What she left out was just as important as what she said: no mention of the fire, no acknowledgement of his badge, no hint that he actually lived there. The firefighter stood quietly, a mix of frustration and disbelief tightening in his chest. He'd been on the other side of these calls countless times, responding to real emergencies where seconds mattered. Now he was watching that system being used against him for a parking dispute. He considered interrupting, flashing his ID, or calling his station to clear things up. But experience told him it was better to let the process play out. Any sudden move, any raised voice, could be misinterpreted. As the call continued, Karen's confidence grew. She paced back and forth, occasionally glancing at him with a look that suggested victory was already hers. To her, dialing 911 wasn't a last resort, it was a tool. A way to enforce authority when rules didn't bend the way she wanted. The dispatcher asked if there was immediate danger. Karen hesitated for a fraction of a second, then insisted there was. The sound of sirens broke through the tension before anyone could say another word. At first, Karen's face lit up with satisfaction, as if the noise confirmed everything she believed. She straightened her posture, folded her arms, and watched the end of the street with a tight smile, clearly expecting validation. The firefighter noticed the change immediately, not just in her expression, but in the way nearby neighbors stepped out onto porches, drawn by the unmistakable signal that something serious was happening. Two vehicles turned onto the street almost simultaneously. A police cruiser rolled in first, lights flashing but siren off, followed closely by a fire engine. Then another, and another. The scene transformed in seconds from a quiet suburban block into something that looked like an active response zone. Fire hoses were visible in the truck beds, radios crackled, and uniformed professionals moved with practiced efficiency. This wasn't the response Karen had imagined, but it was already too late to undo. The firefighter standing by his truck barely reacted. He recognized the engine company immediately, spotting familiar faces through the windshields. As the vehicles stopped, doors opened, and boots hit the pavement. One of the responding firefighters looked up, froze for a moment, and then broke into a grin. He called out his name loudly, his voice cutting clean through the air. That single moment shifted the entire atmosphere. Karen's smile faltered. Within seconds, the responding crew surrounded the firefighter, not in confrontation, but in concern. They asked if he was okay, if everything was under control, and why he was standing on the curb instead of heading inside to rest. A police officer approached next, clipboard in hand, listening carefully as the situation unfolded. The firefighter calmly explained what had happened, his tone steady and professional, exactly the way he handled emergencies on the job. The officer nodded, already understanding far more than Karen realized. As the firefighters exchanged quick handshakes and quiet laughs, the truth became impossible to ignore. Badge numbers were checked, names were confirmed. Radios buzzed with brief updates that made it clear this was not a case of impersonation or misuse of resources. This was one of their own, someone who had just come off a legitimate emergency call and returned home. Karen stood off to the side now, no longer the center of attention. Her arms dropped slowly, replaced by nervous fidgeting. She tried to interject, bringing up HOA rules and water usage again, but her words landed flat. The officers weren't dismissive, but they were firm. They explained, clearly and calmly, that emergency responders are protected under the law while performing their duties, and that calling 911 under false pretenses was a serious matter. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others pulling out phones. What Karen thought would be a moment of triumph had turned into public exposure. The flashing lights that once felt empowering now illuminated her mistake for everyone to see. As the firefighter finally leaned back against his truck, surrounded by colleagues who had his back, it became painfully clear this was the moment everything shifted, and there was no way for her to take it back. Once the initial confusion cleared, the focus shifted away from the firefighter and squarely onto Karen. The police officer who had been listening quietly stepped forward, his tone calm but unmistakably serious. He asked her to explain, in her own words, why she believed calling 911 had been necessary. Surrounded by flashing lights, uniformed responders, and an audience of neighbors, Karen launched into another explanation about HOA authority, community rules, and her responsibility to keep order. Each sentence sounded weaker than the last, especially when placed against the reality of multiple emergency vehicles and verified professionals standing right in front of her. The officer listened without interruption, then gently but firmly explained that homeowners associations do not override emergency services or state law. He clarified that firefighters are legally permitted to use water, equipment, and public space when responding to emergencies, and that questioning those actions through emergency channels was not only inappropriate, but potentially dangerous. Every unnecessary call, he reminded her, could delay help for someone who truly needed it. Karen's face flushed as the weight of his words began to sink in. She tried to pivot, claiming she was just being cautious. That she didn't know for sure who the firefighter was. That argument collapsed almost immediately when the officer pointed out the uniform, the marked fire engine, the logged emergency call, and the crew members who personally confirmed his identity. What she framed as concern now looked very much like misuse of emergency services. At that point, the conversation turned procedural. The officer informed her that false or exaggerated emergency reports can result in citations, fines, or worse, depending on intent and outcome. He explained the law plainly, not as a threat, but as a matter of fact. Karen's confidence visibly drained away. Her shoulders slumped, and she glanced around, suddenly aware of how many people were watching. The HOA itself was no longer untouchable either. One of the neighbors, who happened to be on the board, quietly approached and asked what had happened. When the situation was explained, his expression tightened. He apologized directly to the firefighter, acknowledging that this behavior did not represent the community. The words stung more than any ticket could have. For the first time, Karen realized she wasn't speaking for the HOA, she was standing alone. Phones were still out. Whispers spread quickly. The authority Karen believed she wielded so effortlessly had evaporated in minutes. Instead of enforcing rules, she was being corrected, educated, and documented. The officer finished taking notes and issued a warning, making it clear that any future misuse of 911 would not be handled so lightly. As the emergency vehicles began to clear out, the power dynamic had completely flipped. The firefighter, once the target, was now supported by law enforcement, his crew, and the neighborhood. Karen remained on the sidewalk, silent, confronted by the consequences of confusing control with responsibility. By the time the last fire engine pulled away and the flashing lights faded from the street, the silence felt heavier than the noise that had come before it. What had started as a loud, confrontational scene now ended in quiet discomfort. Neighbors lingered for a few moments, exchanging looks and murmured comments, before slowly retreating back inside. Karen remained where she was, rooted to the sidewalk, watching as the firefighter closed his truck door and finally headed toward his front door. The reality of what had just happened settled in all at once. This was no longer a private dispute or a rule enforcement moment she could spin in her favor. It had played out in front of law enforcement, emergency responders, and the very people she believed she had authority over. The warning she received echoed in her mind. But even more painful was the realization that her reputation had taken a public hit she couldn't undo with an email or a board meeting. The firefighter paused briefly at his steps, turning back not with anger, but with calm finality. He didn't say much, only that he hoped she understood the seriousness of misusing emergency services. His tone wasn't threatening or smug. It was tired, honest, and disappointed. That, more than anything, made her look away. There was nothing left to argue. Later that evening, the HOA board acted quickly. An email went out to the entire community clarifying emergency protocols and explicitly stating that no resident had the authority to interfere with first responders. The message included a formal apology to the firefighter and his family. Though Karen's name wasn't mentioned directly, everyone knew exactly why the message had been sent. The lines between personal ego and community responsibility had been redrawn. Over the next few days, the consequences continued to unfold. Neighbors who once nodded along with Karen's strict rule enforcement now kept their distance. Conversations stopped when she approached. The power she once exercised through intimidation had vanished, replaced by an unspoken understanding that she had crossed a line. Even within the HOA, her influence weakened. Decisions were questioned. Motions she supported were delayed or shut down. Trust, once lost, proved impossible to regain quickly. For the firefighter, life returned to normal in the quiet, steady way it always did. Another shift, another call, another emergency answered without hesitation. But the memory of that day lingered not as anger, but as a reminder of how easily authority can be abused, and how important it is to stand firm with patience and professionalism. As for Karen, the regret was instant and lasting. One impulsive phone call, made out of pride rather than necessity, had unraveled the image she worked so hard to maintain. In a community built on rules, she learned the hard way that respect isn't enforced, it's earned. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life HOA karma, entitled Karen Meltdowns, and satisfying instant regret moments, make sure you subscribe to the channel. New stories are uploaded regularly, and you want to miss the next one. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the community because the next story might be even crazier than this one. Bellfire.